Hey guys, Jay Steven here. I wanted to go ahead and do a podcast about the Norwegian Crusade, which took place between 1107 and 1111. So the Norwegian Crusade is quite famous because it was led by Sigurd Magnusson. And Sigurd was a king of Norway, and therefore he is in fact the first European king to set out on a crusade. So that's quite a distinction that belongs to him. And one thing that's interesting about this crusade is it takes place very soon in the aftermath of the First Crusade. And it takes place during the reign of King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. So this is part of the early stirrings and the rising interest in this new thing called crusading that really started to pick up in the first couple of decades after the First Crusade. And since I just finished a fairly large documentary about the First Crusade and then a series of podcasts about the 11th century and the lead up to the First Crusade, I want to start focusing on a lot of these podcasts on this early period. So the early period of the establishment of the Crusader states, the First Crusades heading out to the Holy Land, and also the spread of the crusading movement into Spain and Portugal, or what would become Portugal, and also the start of the Northern Crusades. I'm going to touch on some of that in the near future. I'm going to look at the Wendish Crusade. So anyway, let's jump into the Norwegian Crusade. So first of all, who was Sigurd Magnusson? Well, he was born circa 1090, and he was the son of King Magnus III of Norway. He shared the throne quite amicably with his two brothers, so they were jointly, all three of them, kings of their respective realm. And once these three brothers came to the throne, they decided that they wanted to go to the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem to bring aid to the Christian kingdom there. Now, as we just mentioned, the First Crusade had recently happened. Tales of the recent capture of Jerusalem were spreading far and wide throughout Christendom, and these three kings of Norway heard about this and they wanted to do something about it. And so it was decided that Sigurd would actually be the one to lead this expedition because he had the most experience in battle. So in the autumn of 1107, Sigurd departed from Bergen with some 60 ships and around 5,000 men. He was not yet 20 years old when he did this. So what was going to happen at this point was a very long journey that was going to span quite a few years. And Sigurd and his men were going to encounter some of the leading figures in Christendom of the day. The first thing that happened is they landed in England at the court of King Henry I of England. King Henry, of course, was the son of William the Conqueror, the Norman who had originally conquered England. And King Henry welcomed Sigurd and his men quite warmly, and the Norwegians wintered quite happily at the English court and departed the following spring in 1108. Now, next, Sigurd and his men landed in Galicia, in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, and they wintered near Santiago de Compostela. They defeated some Viking pirates off the coast of Spain, and then raided and occupied Muslim-held Lisbon and Sintra. And of course, as we all know, Lisbon was going to become one of the great cities of Portugal. Sigurd and his men next defeated a Muslim force near Alcar de Sal, and loaded with loot, they then sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar and landed in Norman Sicily in 1109. Here they wintered at the court of Roger II of Sicily, who was at the time only 12 or 13. He too welcomed them quite warmly. Once they departed Sicily, the Norwegians arrived finally in Palestine at the port city of Acre, which was one of the principal ports of the newly established Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. So finally, after 3 years, they arrived at the Crusader kingdom that they'd originally set out to help. Now, Sigurd and his Norwegians arrived not too long after King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, so that's the current ruler of Jerusalem at this point. He was the younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, who was defender of the Holy Sepulchre from 1099 until 1100. And Baldwin had been crowned in 1100 and now had been ruling the kingdom of Jerusalem since then, so for the last 10 years. And King Baldwin was quite delighted with the arrival of the Norwegians and wanted to enlist their aid in his campaigns against the Muslims, his campaigns to expand the kingdom. So, to discuss Sigurd and King Baldwin's campaigning together, I want to turn to one of our best primary sources for Sigurd's involvement in the kingdom of Jerusalem, and that is Fulker of Chartres. Fulker, of course, was originally King Baldwin's chaplain, and so was a very well-positioned individual to know what was going on. So his account of the Norwegian Crusade is quite valuable. So let's take a look at what Fulker has to say about this. How Sidon was besieged and captured by King Baldwin and the Norwegians. Meanwhile, there landed at Jaffa certain Norwegian people, whom God had inspired to make the pilgrimage from the western sea to Jerusalem. Their fleet had 55 ships. Their leader was a very handsome youth, a kinsman of the king of that country. And of course, Fulker is in error there because Sigurd was the king of his country. When King Baldwin returned to Jerusalem, he was filled with joy by the advent of these people. He conversed with them in a friendly manner, urging and even begging them to remain for the love of God in the Holy Land for even a very little time, in order to aid in extending and glorifying the Christian name. Then, having accomplished something for Christ, they could afterwards return to their own land, rendering generous thanks to God. They received the request favorably, replying that they had come to Jerusalem for no other purpose. They said that wherever the king wished to go with his army, there they would gladly go by sea at the same time, provided that he would supply the necessary sustenance for them. This was conceded on one side and ratified on the other. At first they were disposed to march against Ascalon, but at last they adopted a more glorious project, to advance upon and besiege Sidon. The king moved his army away from Acre. The Norwegians proceeded by ship from Jaffa. At that time the fleet of the emir of Babylon, and of course that's the Fatimids, was lying hidden in the port of Tyre. From it, the Saracens very often went in piratical fashion against our Christian pilgrims, and thus protected and encouraged the maritime cities, up to then belonging to the king of Babylon. And I just want to make clear that when Fulker talks about the king of Babylon, he is talking about the Fatimids of Egypt. It's basically kind of a biblical way of referring to them. The Fatimid vizier at this time was Al-Afdal, so that is the quote-unquote king of Babylon that Fulker is referencing. But when the Saracens heard reports of the Norwegians, they dared not come forth from the port of Tyre and do battle with them. When Sidon was reached, the king besieged it by land, and the Norwegians by sea. When our siege engines were completed, the enemy within the walls were so terrified that the garrison of mercenaries begged of King Baldwin that he permit them to go forth safely, and if he pleased, he might retain in the city the peasants because of their usefulness in cultivating the land. This they sought, this they obtained. The hired soldiers thus departed without their pay. The rustics remained peacefully under the aforesaid terms. Okay, so that's an interesting account from Fulker of the Norwegians and their campaign with King Baldwin to capture the port city of Sidon. Now, if you look at a map of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at this time, you can see where Sidon is located on the Palestinian coast. Sidon is south of the port city of Beirut, which Baldwin had just captured, and it is north of the port city of Tyre, which was still in Muslim hands at this time. And south, of course, of Tyre is Acre, which was already in Crusader hands, followed by Haifa, also in Crusader hands, and Caesarea, one of the first port cities captured. It was captured in 1101, so it was also in Crusader hands. And then south of that, you've got Arsuf and Jaffa, both of which belong to the Crusaders as well at this point. And then far south of that, closer to Egypt, you've got Ascalon, which also is in Muslim hands. So really at this point, we've just got Sidon, Tyre, and Ascalon in Muslim hands. And of course, King Baldwin and the Norwegians were able to add Sidon to the Crusader conquests. I want you to take notice of the fact that King Baldwin granted the Muslim inhabitants of Sidon good terms. Those who wanted to leave were able to leave. Those who wanted to stay were able to stay. So this is not unlike the terms Saladin granted to the Christians of Jerusalem in 1187 after the siege of Jerusalem. Of course, one difference here is that nobody was required to pay a ransom to get away. King Baldwin simply allowed them to depart. Now, this happened frequently when the Crusaders were capturing Muslim cities in this early period. The early kingdom of Jerusalem, like King Baldwin I, often did grant very good terms to the Muslims to encourage them to surrender their cities. So, we often hear this thing about how somehow Saladin was so much more merciful than the Crusaders were, but this really flies in the face of what we know historically about this. And I think especially when we look at these early campaigns, we see how erroneous this idea is. I mean, the truth is that the Crusaders often granted the same sort of terms that Saladin was granting when he was engaged in his serious conquests. Okay, so now I want to turn to a Muslim source for the Norwegian Crusade. This is Ibn al-Qalanisi, possibly our earliest primary source from the Muslim side for the history of the Crusades. Ibn al-Qalanisi was based in Damascus, and he was well informed about these events. And this is his description of the Norwegian Crusade. One of my favorite parts of this account is Ibn al-Qalanisi's description of this incredible tower that the Crusaders created to attack Sidon with. It's really interesting. Listen for that. It really tells us something about how these sieges were conducted. Reports were received in this year of the arrival of one of the kings of the Franks by sea. He's talking about Sigurd there, with more than 60 vessels laden with men-at-arms. Notice that Ibn al-Qalanisi's figure for the number of ships that Sigurd had is really close to Fulcair's. I believe Fulcair's was 55, so 55 versus 60. For the purpose of making the pilgrimage and raiding the lands of Islam, he went up towards Jerusalem, and when Baldwin came out to meet him, it was agreed between them to attack the Islamic territories. On their return from Jerusalem, they encamped before the fortified port of Sidon, 19th October 1110, and blockaded it by land and sea. The Egyptian fleet was then stationed at the port of Tyre, but it was unable to bring support to Sidon. The Franks made a tower and moved it forwards toward the town, having draped it with branches of vines, mats, and damp ox hides as a protection against missiles and Greek fire. So, of course, all of that was thrown on this tower to prevent it from burning. When they had completed its construction in this skillful fashion, they moved it up at intervals of several days on pulley wheels inserted beneath it. On the day of the attack, when it had been brought close up to the wall, they moved it forward, having placed in it supplies of water and vinegar to put out fires and fighting machines. When those in Sidon saw what was afoot, their hearts sank, and they feared a repetition of a disaster like that at Beirut. The Cadi and a number of the principal men of the town were sent out to the Franks, and they asked Baldwin for a guarantee of safety. He agreed to their request and promised also security to the troops who were with them in respect of their lives and property, and to allow those who wished to leave the town to proceed to Damascus. When they had sworn him to these terms, the governor and controller of the administration, together with all the troops and guards and a great number of the townsmen, went out and proceeded to Damascus on the 4th of December, 1110. The siege having lasted 47 days, so this siege went on for quite some time. After establishing a garrison in the town and regulating its affairs, Baldwin returned to Jerusalem, but a short time later he returned to Sidon and exacted from those who had remained in it a tribute exceeding 20,000 dinars, whereby he reduced them to poverty and stripped them of their possessions, and confiscated the property of all of them who were known to have any residue. So Ibn al-Qalanisi was not happy with the tax that Baldwin ended up imposing on the Muslims who remained in Sidon. I think we can be a bit suspicious, though, of the idea that he imposed an absolute crushing tax that wiped everybody out in Sidon. You wouldn't want to do that if if you owned that city, you would want the economic activity to continue. There were a lot of Muslims who lived in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they certainly were allowed to prosper and engage in commerce and accumulate wealth. They definitely had a tax that they had to pay to their Christian overlords, just as Christians living in Muslim lands had to do the same. But I doubt that it was a crushing tax on either side that eliminated the economic capability of both. Both Muslim and Christian rulers tended to want to maintain the economic activity of their subjects. I want to read one more source to you guys. This is from the Christian side again, and this is Albert of Aachen. Albert of Aachen wrote an account of the First Crusade from the perspective of Godfrey of Bouillon, and then he continued to document the Kingdom of Jerusalem under King Baldwin I, Godfrey's younger brother. So I want to go ahead and read to you from Albert. Albert offers us some really kind of interesting and striking details about the interaction between these two kings. And he also gives some really good details about the tower that Ibn al-Qalanisi describes. So I want to look at both of those. So let's look at a couple passages from Albert here. But the king, having left part of his army to assist the Christian citizens of Acre, on the advice of his wisest men, turned aside in the first place to Jaffa to consult the King of Norway, so that he might hear from his lips and find out what he should do and perform first. Soon they were allied by every loving kiss, and the king, called Magnus — now Albert is in error here, of course the king was Sigurd, and I'm going to change Magnus to Sigurd throughout the rest of my reading of Albert, just for convenience sake. Sigurd beseeched King Baldwin with all his might to make the journey with him to worship in Jerusalem, at the bidding of Lord Jesus, whereby he orders his faithful people to seek first the kingdom of God, and afterwards all good things will be found by those who seek. Then he dealt with the question of which town he would choose to besiege with his naval force. King Baldwin fell in with the wishes of King Sigurd and his own chiefs with all good will, and consented to go with them to Jerusalem as they had vowed. Therefore, as both kings were going up into the holy city, the entire clergy, clothed in albs and all the splendid dress of divine religion, singing hymns and songs, met them with all the citizens and people, and they led the kings with all their company all the way to the Lord's sepulchre, singing in exultation. Indeed, King Baldwin was leading King Sigurd by the hand with honor and brotherly love, in accordance with the speech of the apostle, who encourages us to outdo each other in honor. He was indeed leading him and teaching him all the holy places and those things he considered noteworthy, and he looked after him for some days with much feasting and royal entertainment. Then, as they were confirmed more and more in love and loyalty, he went down with him in a strong company to the river Jordan, where the Christian ceremony was performed in the name of Lord Jesus. Then he led that self-same King Sigurd back to Jerusalem in triumph and rejoicing, safe and sound from all disturbance. Okay, now I want to read this little passage from Albert about this siege tower that's so interesting. King Baldwin and Bertrand, now that's the Count of Tripoli, having summoned their troops, established the blockade on the landward side. The King of Norway dropped anchor with all his force and secured his position around the city on the seaward side. So Baldwin and his knights were besieging from the land. The Norwegians were doing the sea blockade with their ships. With the blockade in place thus, they pressed hard the walls and towers of the city by attack and constant destruction for the entire month of September, while the citizens, for their part, fought back strongly from within with weapons and a stone hurler. And then the Christians placed against the wall an engine, which had taken many days to construct, and posted inside it men with crossbows, who would stand above the walls from the height of the engine's upper stories, and look over the city and its towers and ramparts, and thus harass the streets and roads with an irresistible destruction. Now notice what they're saying here. This tower was tall enough that they could put crossbowmen up at the top of it, and they could shoot into the city. So the tower was taller than the walls. This, of course, was the thing you wanted to do when you were making a siege tower. You wanted it to be taller than the walls of the city you were besieging, if possible. It was a huge strategic advantage. After cooperating with King Baldwin in the capture of Sidon, King Sigurd sailed on to Constantinople. There he was royally entertained, gave his ships to the Emperor Alexius, and left some of his men in the latter's service. So some of Sigurd's men joined the Varangian Guard. He and the rest traveled overland to Denmark and crossed to Norway in the summer of 1111, thus returning much faster than they had come. All right, and that ends my podcast on the topic of the Norwegian Crusade. I'd like to give a shout out to my friend Harald Baldr, who is himself Norwegian, and this is his favorite crusade. So this one goes out to you, my friend. I hope you guys will check out Harald's YouTube channel, which deals with some very interesting topics of history. I will put a link to it below. And yeah, everybody take care. I'll talk to you soon.